thy neighbor.
Peace and greetings to all the neighbors that have decided to join me on today's journey. We have a New York aficionado. He knows that New York underground scene all the way from rock to hip hop. Not only that, he turned that love and passion into becoming an author. Very interesting. I can talk all day, but let him introduce himself. This man is
Howie Abrams, Howieabrams. So grew up Queens Village, New York. It's basically part of Jamaica. If you know Queens, it's sort of Hillside Avenue, Springfield Boulevard, around that. And for all intents and purposes, Queens Village was real boring. Not a lot of interesting stuff going on there. And you're kind of far from Manhattan, which is where you ultimately want to go. So I had to take like a 35-minute bus ride and then about a 40-minute train ride to get into Manhattan. And once I was about 14 or so, I would do that all the time, like multiple times a week. And you know, there were definitely some great people in Queens. I think people think of Queens now and it's like this incredible melting pot and like all the millions of cultures that are there. People talk about it, you know, all the time, but it didn't feel that way then, you know? It felt like you were kind of isolated and there wasn't a lot going on. So the goal was to go somewhere else. And so you knew about Manhattan and you knew about the things going on there. So you really kind of strive to get yourself there as often as possible, to experience more culture, music, you know, art, all of those things that, you know, you started to learn about when you were kind of old enough to do so. And, you know, but, you know, Queens was fine, you know, it was a fine place. The boroughs of New York, they change also. So if you look at the boroughs in the 70s, 80s in New York, Queens was different from Brooklyn, was different from Staten Island, the Bronx, Manhattan. All of it was really different. You looked at people in Manhattan as the rich people, you know, so especially when you were young, because it wasn't quite as expensive to live there as it is now, but it was expensive to live there. And it was more reasonable to be in one of the boroughs. Staten Island was its own kind of animal. I think a lot of people looked at it as like an annex of New Jersey. And you know, it had its own animal. It was like largely white, a lot of blue collar cops, firemen. That was kind of the scene in Staten Island, kind of still is. The Bronx had a lot of Latino culture, a lot of Puerto Ricans, a lot of Dominicans, et cetera, et cetera. Queens had different pockets, as did Brooklyn. So you had primarily white areas, you had primarily black areas, you had Latino areas, but then you also had, like now, for instance, in Queens, there's a lot of people from India, a lot of people from Pakistan, a lot of people from the Middle East. So Kaves, for instance, grew up in Bay Ridge. And now there's tons of Lebanese people in Bay Ridge, where originally it was a Norwegian-like port town and then became sort of very Irish, very Italian, very German. They're all really different. And they're also really different from the original settlers there. So the original people who came over from Europe, from South America, from wherever, that first lived in these places, they may or may not still live there. But Queens, for instance, you hear about it all the time, has probably the largest mix of cultures in America in one place. And they live very close together and they interact and they eat each other's food and all of those things. And it's pretty incredible for that reason alone. I grew up loving all genres of music. I think part of that was Queens and part of that was growing up with different people. Different types of people, different cultures. So growing up in Queens Village, you were a town over from Hollis. So if you think about Hollis and you know what was going on there early on, that's where Russell Simmons was from. That's where Run DMC came from. That's where LL Cool J came from. So when I was young, maybe at the end of elementary school, beginning of junior high school, you realize that some of the people that you went to school with were like the younger brothers and sisters of people in the Hollis crew. And, you know, Russell was throwing his parties over on Jamaica Avenue. And I wasn't like really aware of all that yet, but you started, for instance, with hip hop to become aware of the clothing. So you saw Adidas Superstars, and you saw people wearing Kangol, and you saw later on like the black sweatshirts with like the Playboy bunny iron-ons, and like they all had little crews of like whether they were breakdancers or whatever it was, and you started to notice that kind of stuff. And so then you realized there was music attached to that. But where I grew up, there were like the older brothers and sisters of a lot of the kids that I knew were into like what became classic rock. They were into like Led Zeppelin and the Doors and all that. And I never liked that stuff really. I was never a big fan of that stuff because it felt old to me. And I didn't like these older brothers and sisters. I thought they were all jerks. So, and these musicians, a lot of them were dead. You couldn't go see them, you know? So you couldn't go see the Doors if you liked the Doors. I didn't like the Doors, but you couldn't go see them. Led Zeppelin was broken up. The Rolling Stones weren't playing, all that stuff. I couldn't relate to it. It wasn't tangible. You couldn't go see this music. And so some of the older brothers and sisters of the people I was friends with started getting into heavy metal. So things like after Black Sabbath, in the early 80s, things like Iron Maiden would pop up and Judas Priest. And that stuff was more aggressive and it had more of an edge to it. And these bands played, they were real, like you could go see them. And so that was a big deal for me, you know, is that it was real at that time. And so I loved that music. I loved Iron Maiden. That was one of my early favorite bands. And so from that, you know, you progressed to even more aggressive bands. So then Metallica pops up, you know, in 1983, and you're like, what the fuck is this? And then not long after, you discovered punk and hardcore. And those bands played every single weekend at CBGB's. And so that was real aggressive. And there was no separation between the band and the audience. So you could be standing next to some guy and talking to him about his band and not realizing he's the next band up and he's gonna play in 5 minutes. And so a lot of that happened, and I really appreciated that lack of distance. So with the metal bands, there was always like the arena shows and you felt like all the way over there and the band was all the way over there. And that was just a weird thing. It felt like you were watching something on television, you know? It wasn't tangible, it wasn't right in front of you. But the club metal shows and the club hardcore stuff was right in your face and you could participate in it. And all the bands needed help. So it was like you could carry some gear into the club and they would just put you on the guest list, you know, just for helping them, because they didn't have managers, they didn't have roadies, they didn't have any of that stuff. So there was this incredible culture and community around that world that I really appreciated and really latched onto. And I just met so many people that way. Eventually, I went on to do a fanzine, like while I was in high school, and interviewing these bands and talking to them about what they were doing, and they were super accessible. And it was amazing because, again, you didn't realize you were networking, but you were, because you were out there and you were meeting people and you were talking to them and helping them out if you could. And there was very little ego involved. It was pretty incredible to grow up at that time, like early 80s to the mid 80s, late 80s. There was so much great music going on. And so between like loving hip hop as a Queens kid and getting into this punk and hardcore stuff and the underground metal stuff, it was just exciting. And there was an incredible energy around it. And I feel lucky to have grown up around that time in New York City. Even going back in terms of my relationship with music, I was a huge Kiss fan. And I'm talking about the OG up to 1979 Kiss, the original four guys. And I love the like, certainly I loved the music and I loved obviously the image and the whole thing. But there was this larger than lifeness about them that I really appreciated, that, you know, they would always strive to be the biggest spectacle and make everybody notice them. And I loved that. And I discovered them from being like a wrestling fan and like going and looking at wrestling magazines and then seeing Kiss on the cover of a magazine right next to the wrestling magazines and being like, who are these freaks? You know, and like wanting to know more. And then you find out, oh, they're a band and there's records and like I can buy those records and like get even deeper. So I love that discovery of music, right? And it kind of falling in your lap. I wasn't somebody who listened to the radio very much because I didn't like what was on the radio because it was those classic rock bands, and I wasn't about that. I didn't like that stuff. So fast forward a little bit, I get involved with underground music, especially like the punk and hardcore stuff and the metal stuff. And again, you don't realize you're networking. You don't realize that by meeting these people who are in bands that are on like small record labels, but on record labels, you're learning from them, and you're getting a look into this music business that you didn't know was quite there. You just knew you liked music and you'd go see these bands, but there's a whole business around that. And I didn't really pay much attention to that until a little bit later. So while I was sort of roadieing, for a band called Nuclear Assault that I was very close with, they took me to their record company one day for a meeting. I was basically the guy who drove them there. So I didn't realize I'd be sitting in on the meeting, like that I'd be in the room, like, just sitting there quietly, but listening to this conversation. And they weren't particularly happy with their record label. So they were telling the people at the label, including the president, we don't really like the way you're marketing us. I think that you should be doing more for us. It's a very typical indie record label kind of story. And so, one of the guys in the band says, you should hire him, meaning me. And, he knows more than the people you have working here. I was 16 at the time. And they were like, oh yeah, like what would you do? So I told them some things that I would do. And he was kind of impressed by it, but he's like, wait, how old are you? I was like, I'm 16. He goes, all right, I'm not going to be responsible for you leaving high school, to come work here. So he's like, call me when you're done, it's like, and then maybe we have something for you, So lo and behold, I went to college for 1 year after high school, wasn't into it because I didn't know why I was there. I sort of felt like it was part of the rule book. So I went, to college for a year. And then something happened with my financial aid. So I couldn't go the second year. So I was like, I'm gonna call that guy. And I called him. And within 3 weeks, I got hired to be a salesman for what was ultimately the largest independent record distributor in the country. It was called Imprint Records. And so they, aside from all the imports, they distributed all the indie labels that were hot at the time. So I got to, sell records to the stores, which was an unbelievable experience. Because at the end of the day, if you're going to be in the music business, it's a great education to understand why they take in certain records to their stores and why they don't take others. Because at the end of the day, they're in business. At that time, it was like, I could load up my store with Madonna and Michael Jackson records. I don't need to buy your little shit independent, records. But there'd be a few of those stores that really lived off of that independent music, and lived off of these independent labels and would sell hundreds of copies of these underground metal bands and underground punk and hardcore bands and even hip hop at the time. It was still relatively new. It wasn't this massive thing that it as now. So, if you were like a younger or smaller artist, you were sold in these indie stores. You were not sold, in what the big chains were at the time, unless you were on the radio. And most of these artists were not on the radio. So you had to find out about them. You had to listen to, those 2-hour hip hop shows like Red Alert, playing brand new records, and you would tape them off of the radio. Like, oh, he's gonna play a new, Slick Rick record. Like, I gotta tape that because that's gonna be new. And so it was this indie music culture that was going on that eventually got huge. These artists got really big, a lot of them. But selling those records was huge, such an education. And then within 6 months of me being a loudmouth, opinionated kid, I got one of the people there because Imprint had a couple of record labels in the same building as the distributor. So there was Relativity Records and there was a metal label called Combat Records. And so I would watch what they were doing. And I became a little dissatisfied with what Combat was doing because I was like, man, they're like ignoring certain bands that they have for other bands. And I didn't understand that because some of these bands that happen to have been hardcore bands sold as many records and drew more people than these metal bands that they were dumping money into. So I kept complaining and complaining to people there. And they're like, oh yeah, like again, like Like, what are you gonna do about it, you know? I was like, well, you know, if you started another label, you could focus on this stuff and really pay attention to it and give it its day. And they were like, okay. And this was 6 months after I was selling records. So I was like, really? You know, like you're willing to do that? So we started a label called In Effect Records. And on In Effect Records, we took a couple of bands off of Combat and put them on In Effect. So the first one was Agnostic Front, who were the biggest New York hardcore band in the world at the time. And we were like, let's do something that helps them more than just being on this metal label. So we started that. And then we did a record with Prong, who were another band that was up and coming. Like, people didn't really know them that well at the time. And then because we distributed a label called Roar, R-O-I-R, which stood for Reach Out International. And they were an all cassette label, mostly reggae, but they had the Bad Brains Roar cassette. That was the first ever Bad Brains release, proper release. So we're like, you know what? CDs are kind of a thing now. Why don't we take that and make it a CD for the first time? And so the first day of In Effect Records was Agnostic Front live at CBGB's, which we recorded, the second Prong album, and the Bad Brains Roar cassette on CD for the very first time. So that was our first day. So that was pretty great, you know, and we wanted to have more than one release on that first day so that people would think we were legit. You know, it wasn't just, we just did one record and who knows when the next one's coming out, and, you know, and then we signed Sick of It All, and we signed 24/7 Spies, and we signed, you know, Madball, and we did an EP with them, and then a whole bunch of stuff, you know. And then what's crazy is this band that I roadied for, Nuclear Assault, they were on Combat, and I got to put out and market their biggest record. So that was an incredible full circle moment, you know, from like lugging gear into clubs to putting out what wound up being their biggest ever record. And so that was incredible, you know, and I feel like I got really lucky. Like, I totally stepped in shit with this company agreeing to start this record label, you know, for me. And at the time, I'm not even 20 yet, you know? So this was all like, you know, from this meeting at 16, you know, to like now I'm doing this stuff, you know, I was still 19 years old. So this all happened real quick. And you know, like, In Effect didn't last that long. It was maybe 4 years, but what an incredible experience, learning experience. The people I met that I'm still friends with, you know, I just did a book with Lou and Pete from Sick of It All. I signed them when I was 19 years old, you know, things like that. So there's this whole just long thread of things that have happened, you know? And then after In Effect, I went on and worked at a label called Roadrunner, which was another huge independent label. International too. They had offices in Amsterdam because they were based over there, but Germany, Japan, Brazil, like, so when you signed a band in America, you could put out their records all over the world, which was huge because it gave you all of these other opportunities for the band to do well. And sometimes the band would just take off in Europe, you know, and not do great here. Sometimes it would be everywhere. Sometimes it would just be America. It happened, you know, different ways all the time. But that international experience was incredible. And then I got to go over to Europe a lot of times and see how the market worked there and what fans liked there. And it was just a very different thing. They had the festival culture over there. So every summer from sort of June to September, you had those massive festivals. And they would have festivals over there, whether it would have been hip hop or aggressive, you know, guitar kind of driven music, that you didn't even have massive headliners. They were like bands that we grew up with and liked would headline these massive festivals all over Europe and basically draw 100,000 people to these things. And I got to see that. And that was crazy. I mean, crazy, you know? And in 1995, I went over and there was this one festival in Holland called the Dynamo Festival. Half the festival was Roadrunner bands. I mean, it was incredible. And it might as well have just been the Roadrunner Festival, you know? And there were 120,000 people there. And to see something like that with this little music that you sort of grew up with and was like, you'd go see shows with 75 people, you know, and things like that. And then you'd go see them play in front of 120,000 people. And those people have their records and they know the words and they go berserk when they play. So little Madball, who I signed like a 7-inch with, when I worked at In Effect, went on at like 12 noon at that festival and half the place is going berserk. So like 60,000 people know exactly who they are and love them. And so to go see that, before they were even, now they're a much bigger band, but even then, like to see that kind of reception and that kind of passion for them and that kind of love for a band like that, who was this independent, like little New York hardcore band. When I first did the 7-inch, Freddie, the singer, was 12, so like I signed, like it was 3 guys from Agnostic Front and a little kid. And everybody like knew and loved this record. In America, you knew like the hardcore kids knew it, but to see it on that scale was crazy. And I could only see that by going across the Atlantic Ocean, And so I was given that opportunity, which was amazing. Danny Lilker was a very good friend of mine, still is a very good friend of mine. And so he was in Anthrax. And so I was a fan of Anthrax, and then I was a fan of Nuclear Assault, then eventually got to become their record label. So in like, I think it was probably 1987, he would be off tour and we'd hang out and like whatever. So we got very into going to Jack's, which was Jack in the Box, and they had Taco Tuesday. So it was this place in Queens on Northern Boulevard, and we go to Taco Tuesday. And we hatched this idea of this band because Danny was always into super extreme music. That was his thing. Like the faster the better, like the crazier the better. That was his thing as a fan. So we put this idea together for this band called Extra Hot Sauce. And Extra Hot Sauce because of Jack's, because Danny used to put extra hot sauce on his tacos and sweat like a freak. And like, we were like, what are you doing? Like, why are you using so much hot sauce? And of course he would use the hottest that they had. And we were like, there's our band name, Extra Hot Sauce. So Danny was a bass player, but he wanted to play drums because he wanted to play real fast. He wanted to be the fastest drummer. So we're like, okay. So we started a band with him on drums. I was the singer, and 2 of my childhood friends from like junior high school and high school, one was the guitar player and one was the bass player. Our bass player, Rob, never played bass in his life. Danny just taught him how to play the songs. So we would just rehearse like as a fun thing to do. Like instead of like whatever, like let's go to a rehearsal space and like we'll play cover songs and like do shit like that. And then we started like writing a couple of songs. So we decided, because of Danny's stature in the music thing, we could probably get someone to put out a record. So that's what we did. We got this underground label called Peaceville that was based in the UK, who Danny was very good friends with the owner. He's like, I'll do a record with you guys. So he gave us some money and we recorded an album. And so Extra Hot Sauce. So I was in a short-lived band with Danny. So that was another weird full circle thing from having been a fan since 1984. And then, 3 years later, 4 years later, I'm sort of in a band with Danny. I did make the mistake of putting my parents' address on the back of the album. And so we got fan mail because I was like, what's going to come of this? Who cares? And so we would get mail to my parents' house. And like, me, I was like, I got to answer all of it. I got to get back to these people. I don't want to be the dick in the band who doesn't, write back to people. So that was a mistake on my part. Scott Ian from Anthrax also became a friend pretty early on from just being a fan, and being in Queens. So my friend John Rooney, who I went to school with, that's who I did my fanzine with. He and I somehow, from going to early Anthrax shows, became friendly with him. And so he saw that we were the kids who would go off on the dance floor and whatever, and we were legit fans that really knew the Anthrax stuff when they were just not starting, but like they were starting to become a thing, in New York and around the world. And so we became friends with Scott. So again, I got to be around a lot of things that I couldn't have possibly seen or experienced otherwise. So we would go on tour with them. So we would, let's say, take Amtrak to meet those guys in Rhode Island, and go see Anthrax shows in Rhode Island and Boston and whatever. And we would travel with them on the bus, for a few cities, and sort of seeing the inner workings of tour. And that kind of stuff was amazing. And then later I got to do it again with Danny and a Nuclear Assault. And on a smaller level, because now Anthrax starts blowing up by like 1987, they're a big band. And they're playing with Black Sabbath in arenas and, you know, doing that kind of stuff. So we got to see all that. So I'm still a kid, but we're going backstage in arenas and seeing the inner workings and seeing how many people it takes to put on one of those shows, you know, one of these massive arena shows, and how it differs from the club shows. Although the club shows were always more fun because the energy was so different, you know, you were like right there, you know? And so that was pretty incredible. And then, you know, it's funny because John and I broke off almost into like two camps a little bit. Like I got closer with Danny and Nuclear Assault, and he got really close with the Anthrax camp. In fact, they did this rap song that was kind of a novelty, but it wound up being like their biggest single. John wrote some of that. And so he was like a songwriter on Anthrax's biggest song. Like, so from us interviewing them for our fanzine, he had that moment. And then he became Scott's tech for years. So he was on the road with Anthrax for years and years and years. And I went sort of the record label route and was doing that. After I worked at Jive, so I worked at Jive Records and Zomba Music Publishing. It was the same company basically, but one was the publishing arm, one was the record company. Everybody knows Jive Records, right? So aside from its history with hip hop, KRS-One, Tribe, E40, you know, Too Short, all that stuff, right? And then they wound up having that massive pop success with the boy band thing, right? So you had Backstreet Boys and Britney Spears and NSYNC all on Jive Records. So it just blew up. It became 10 times bigger than it had been. And so I was lucky enough to get hired there after working at Roadrunner. And initially I worked for the publishing company, and then they would also have me do A&R for the record company. And I signed a band there called Bowling for Soup, who got really big. We had 2 platinum records, you know, and it was the only rock band really at the time on Jive Records. And so, but they had this huge pop success. They were on like Z100 kind of radio stations. They weren't like cool punk band, even though they were like a pop punk band. So I was there for a long time. I was there for 10 years, signed a lot of great bands to publishing deals. And then I had the opportunity to go work at Warner Chappell, which was part of the Warner Music Group. I'd never worked at a major label, anything before. Jive was independent almost the entire time I was there. It got bought, which is why a lot of things shifted towards the end there. And so I went over to Warner Music Group, and they're like, we want to give you an Imprint label. And so we're going to sign some artists for records and for publishing. And, you know, you do it, you know, like you do your thing. And so I created this idea of Perfect Game because we were like a small thing that could treat artists, you know, personally, but we were in a big company. So there was the potential upside was whatever. It could be, anybody could be as big as, you know, they were capable of being. So I signed rapper Ill Bill. I signed, it was the Lords of Brooklyn when I signed them, but we sort of pivoted to them being just called the Lords, so that they would kind of be a new band because their sound was different than what they'd been doing before, which was more sort of strictly beat-driven hip-hop. This had a band to it, and there was like a punk edge to it and things like that. So the whole thing was short-lived, unfortunately, because you were in a corporate environment. It was all about shareholders, you know, and they wanted things to happen real big, real fast. And it's like, that's not how independent record labels work. And so they wanted it, but they didn't know how to be patient with it. And so it was a bit of an issue. So I was out of there after 2 years. And at that time, that's when the music business really changed. This was around 2008, when digital really came in and the whole Napster hoopla started, and labels didn't quite know what to do. And kids were focused on things different than music. So like when we grew up, it was music, music, music. You loved music. You wanted to go see artists. You wanted to buy records. Kids were now more into the internet, and they were into games, you know, and gaming. And they were becoming very technically savvy. And that's how a thing like Napster starts in the first place, right? But the music business's reaction to things like Napster was sue everybody. instead of figuring, hey, you know what? Some of our audience, this is how they want music now. They want to have it whenever they want to have it. And the music business didn't adjust to it. They fought it. And that was a huge mistake. And it's only now that I think the record companies have figured out how to work with like digital and downloading and streaming. So that's 14 years, you know, since it really first came into play. And it changed. Things really, really changed. So like what I did, there were fewer and fewer people who did that as jobs, you know? Around 2008, when the Perfect Game thing ended, I really saw the music business as being very, very different. There were fewer seats at the labels for what I did for years. So I really decided to just step away from it altogether for a little while. And I was working basically day jobs. You know, I worked at Home Depot, I worked at Paragon Sports. I just had a baby. So my wife and I now have a daughter. And I was like, I gotta be doing something to keep myself occupied and you know, participate in the world. But basically I knew kind of in my heart of hearts that the music industry thing was kind of over for me. So I was doing the, you know, like working at Home Depot after doing what I had just done for all that time was just soul sucking, you know what I mean? It just completely zapped my energy. Like everything was like, whoa, what has become of my life, you know? So I remember on a lunch break, I was talking to Kaves and like sitting outside Home Depot, and he was like, you know what? We're trying to expand what we're doing with the tattoo shop. So he had a shop in Bay Ridge where he lived for years and years. He's like, why don't you come and we'll talk about it? So he wanted someone who could come to not only manage the shop, but also help manage what he was doing, which he was trying to get more into painting again, as opposed to just tattooing. So he wanted to try to maybe find some of like the corporate entities that were working with street artists and things like that. So we started working on things like that. And you know, what's funny is I was at his shop and there's downtime because I would have to come in early. And if there were no appointments, you know, I was just sort of there and there wasn't all that much to do until appointments came in. So I came up with this wacky idea for a book. And it was based off a book that existed that Sasha Jenkins did called The Book of Rap Lists. And so I loved that book as a fan. It was all minutia. Like you had to be such a huge fan of hip hop to like this book and understand this book. It had the craziest lists in it. It wasn't just best albums and all that. It was like, you know, really left field. Like you had to be a super fan to like even care about. And I was like, there's only one other genre of music you could really do a book like that for, and it was metal. So I was like, let's do the Book of Metal Lists. So I hit up Sasha and who we knew, who Kaves knew. Kaves is very close with him. And I was like, you know, what do you think of this idea? Maybe we could do it through Ego Trip, which was what he had, you know, early on before he had Mass Appeal. He used to do Ego Trip. He's like, well, I'm not doing Ego Trip anymore, but I'm more than happy to help you with this book idea. So we went in and met with his literary agent. And I was like, wow, literary agent. You know, I wasn't thinking about any of this because I was like, I just have like a random idea for some book. And so the agent told us how to write the proposal, like, you know, who maybe he would, you know, pitch it to, like all this stuff, like write sort of 10 pages, a description of the book, like the whole thing. And I'd never done this before, even though I had the fanzine and things like that. And I wrote a couple of articles here and there. And he's like, you know, give me the proposal. So we gave him the proposal. And again, in a few weeks, he got us a book deal. And so Sasha and I are now going to co-author the book, and we were going to do a metal version of his rap list book. And it wound up doing quite well. And it's like people cared about it, you know? And we were in the New York Times, we were in Entertainment Weekly, you know, like, so one of our lists was the 200 most embarrassing album covers. And so the New York Times like latched onto it, and they did a Sunday Arts and Leisure section, New York Times, like 2 pages on this list. And so it was crazy, you know, and like we probably didn't sell any books from being in the New York Times, but you know, all the metal blogs, all the metal magazines, they all loved it because they knew that like people love to argue about metal shit, you know, so it was perfect. And so we did that, and then we had success with it. It was great. So not too long afterward, the agent calls me up and he goes, look, you know, I want to be your literary agent too. And I'm like, wow, like I didn't know that that was going to happen. You know, I wasn't even thinking that there'd be another book, you know? So he goes, you know, there's someone looking for an author for a book project. I'm going to submit your name and we'll see what happens. I was like, okay. I was like, what is it? He's like, they want to do a 20th anniversary of the Vans Warped Tour. And so I was like, okay. I was like, you know, I know the guy who started it, right? Because Kaves is very close with Kevin Lyman, who founded the Warped Tour. I was like, I know him as well. I've been to his house, you know, in Pasadena, you know? And so he's like, well, that won't hurt us, will it? I was like, well, just make sure he gets to find out that I would love to do it. So I get hired to do the 20th anniversary Warped Tour book. So that was my second book. And then later on, the guy who owned Roadrunner Records, I had no idea that he started a book publishing company in Amsterdam. And so I contacted him and I was like, wouldn't it be great if there was like a book publishing company that was similar to the independent labels of the 80s who like specialized in genres and like underground stuff and whatever. He's like, that's a great idea. Leave that with me. I'm like, I don't know what leave that with me means, but like, I'll leave that with you, you know? Months later, after not hearing from him or whatever, he goes, remember that idea you brought up to me? He goes, let's do that. So we started a book publishing, you know, imprint. And so it was called Lesser Gods. And it came from the owner of Roadrunner, the name. And he's like, you know, we're never gonna get to publish a book by members of the Rolling Stones, but there are a million lesser gods. And I was like, oh, that's a great name for the company. Let's do that. So he's like, what's your bucket list, you know, for books? I was like, HR from the Bad Brains. And he's like, okay, let's try to do a book with HR. So I wound up doing a book with HR, you know? And then we wound up having an opportunity to pitch him on this book that Kaves and I were working on at the tattoo shop for a hip hop alphabet book, where we were basically like, there's lots of hip hop children's books, but there's no hip hop alphabet book, like a truly educational thing about the movement and the genre, but also like a real cool kids book, you know? And so we did Hip Hop Alphabet, and that went really well. And we wound up getting to do Hip Hop Alphabet 2, you know? And then so through my relationship with Kaves, I introduced him to the guys who managed Metallica. And so he did live paintings with the guys from Tat's Crew and some other people at Metallica's festival, which was called Orion. And so he got to go out to Atlantic City and they did these Metallica themed paintings live during Metallica's festival, which was incredible, you know? And it was real graffiti, you know, but it was Metallica themed. And so they loved what these guys did. And so it started this sort of relationship with Metallica and Kaves. So then fast forward a little bit, and Metallica is gonna have their own art show. And they're gonna pick 20 artists to represent their favorite Metallica song in some form of art, painting, sculpture, metalwork, whatever it was. So Kaves was invited to do that, one of 20 people. And they did it out at Tony Alva's gallery out in California, the famous skateboarder. And so 20 artists were chosen, and Kaves did an incredible painting based off the song Ride the Lightning. And so what he did was he did one of those red subway cars, and it was a play on the third rail with Ride the Lightning. So he was like, in 1985, while Metallica was playing L'Amour, which is also in Bay Ridge, he was like dodging the third rail trying to paint trains, you know, and that they connected that way because they were both sort of going for their fame, you know, like they were both going for what they were passionate about and what meant a lot to them. And so this was his painting, you know, at the thing, and it sold right away to like one of the CEOs of a big energy drink. He bought it, you know. And so again, now Metallica, and the Metallica camp knows who Kaves is. So I was going out to California for the very first time in a long time. And I went out to San Francisco with my family, and I hit up my friend who's the day-to-day manager for Metallica. And I knew him for years and years and years. And I was like, man, and I also secretly wanted to go to Metallica headquarters. They have their home, like this giant building where it's their recording studio, it's their rehearsal space, it's where they do their merch company. It's massive, you know? And so I was like, hey, I'd love to come, like, let's have coffee, whatever. And he's like, why don't you come out to Metallica HQ? And I'm like, yeah. I was like, that's what I wanted him to say. So I go there, I'm gonna go there. And I called up Kaves and I was like, look, I'm gonna be sitting down with this guy. So if we ever have any thoughts about maybe doing a Metallica alphabet book, maybe we should create a page, you know, and this way I could bring it with me. And instead of explaining it, I'll show it to him. So we did an L is for Lars Ulrich page, you know, and he drew it and I wrote a rhyme and this whole thing. And we thought it was great. So I go out and sit with the manager and he goes, man, those alphabet books you've been doing are great. I was like, that's funny that you say that. And then he goes, have you ever thought about doing something like more aggressive or more metal or whatever? I was like, that's funny that you say that. And I whip out like this glossy thing that I had printed of the L page, you know? And he's smiling ear to ear looking at it. And he's like, I love this. He goes, and I think the guys are gonna love it too. And so we start talking about the idea. And he knew I was a super fan. So he knew I knew everything about the band from the beginning to now, you know, and that I was qualified, you know, to do this. And he knew Kaves because Kaves has done 2 paintings now, you know, on behalf of Metallica. So we got to do the ABCs of Metallica, and incredible experience. By far the biggest book I've ever done still. And it was just an incredible experience. And like, we did like little moments in their history, you know, from A to Z. And they were super cool about it. They were quite hands-off, actually. Like, their comments weren't more about, that's not accurate. It was more like, please don't make us look fat, you know? Like, so like Kaves had to like adjust them a few times. It was like, we're really skinny guys. Like, you have to make us look skinnier again. So that was something we got to do, and that was incredible. And what's so cool about it is there's so many unauthorized books out there about these bands, whether they're children's books or not. We got to actually do it with the band. You know, so what we're doing right now is we're just finishing up work on the ABCs of the Grateful Dead. And so we approached their camp because we had this. And also from San Francisco seems to like us. And they were like, sure. I had a radio show there for a while with rapper Ill Bill. And so he and I have always shared like a musical brain, even though I'm not an artist, but like, we like the same artists, we like the same records, whether it be who's our favorite rapper or who's our favorite metal band, or, you know, what's the best thrash metal album of all time. Like, we, you know, it's like conversations I had with Bill and also Vinny Paz that led to the Merciless Book of Metal lists, because we would have these insane conversations like on social media and like start ripping people's album covers and like, you know, not just the best, but the worst, you know? And so we do the, you know, that. And then I don't remember I know what happened. There was a radio station in the East Village called East Village Radio. And we had friends who had their radio shows on that station. And it was a storefront radio station on First Avenue between First and Second Street. And so, you know, we would go see our friends do their radio show, or I would be a guest on their show. It was called the Black and Blue Takeover. And so, you know, we found out that they were looking to do new shows at the station. So my friend from the Black and Blue Takeover introduced me to the guy from the radio station. And he's like, you know, you interested in doing a show? And I was like, yeah. I was like, do you have a metal show, you know? And he's like, no, we really don't. We kind of have like, sort of like a show, but I'm not that happy with them, whatever. So, you know, would you be interested in doing that? I'm like, yeah. Now, I already knew how the station worked because I sat in on other people's shows. And I was like, wow, that'd be cool. And like, who would I do this with? I don't want to do it by myself. That's kind of nuts. And so I thought of Bill. And so Bill and I came up with this idea to create the college radio show we never had, you know? And we would do hardcore and metal, anything aggressive. And so we created Merciless. And it came from the name of the book. He loved it. And we started doing 2-hour radio shows every week there. And so then maybe a year or so into that, East Village Radio shut down. And then we had the opportunity to go out to a place in Bushwick called Bushwick Radio that Bill knew of because it was all hip hop. They may have done a little dance stuff, but it was almost exclusively hip hop shows and stuff. And the guy was super cool. And he's like, come in here and do it here, you know? So we're like, okay. And it was like the ground floor or the basement of like some townhouse in Bushwick that he lived in. And so instead of like getting a new tenant after they lost a tenant, they built it out as a radio station. And he had it really down. He had an app. You could listen to it in a million different other apps, you know, so people could really hear the show. And so we went in and did our first show, and we had a bigger show than everything on Bushwick Radio. Like more people listened to us than anything else he did. So he was so happy because like he was looking at like this is an experiment. And then we became like the biggest thing on his station. And we did it for quite a while longer. And then, you know, some things went on and Bill got busy and I got busy with other things and we just sort of slowed it down and we would do shows once in a while. And I really think we'll probably do it again at some point, but I don't know when, but we had so much fun doing that together. And it was just like an opportunity for me and one of my best friends to just sit there and listen to music and talk about it for 2 hours. And so it was amazing. And I really do hope that we get to do it again. The digital world, in a way, it's so less personal. So I think there's still something to be said. And I think kids suffer from this a lot right now, that they're not in the same room with people, especially like we just went through a pandemic and they were doing school online, you know, so they're not in school and meeting friends and interacting with them and going to get pizza afterward and doing those types of things. So I think you have to know the difference, and there is a big difference between the digital world and the analog world, where you meet people and you talk to them in the same space and they can show you things. Like you can't cook with someone online, right? So like they're not gonna show you a recipe and show you how to do it. You have to be in the room with them, you know? And things like that. Like there's a difference between what you can do in person with someone and the connection you can make than one you can make online. Because also those, it's tough to know if they're genuine, you know? And so it's nice to know that you can see body language and you can know, does this person actually care about what I'm saying? And how much do I care about what they're saying? So I do think organic relationships and analog relationships and people being in the same room is always gonna be better, you know? Like you can watch a band play a digital virtual concert, or you can be in the room with all the fans and feed off that energy and share it with people that are just like you. I think it is so incredibly important to get to know your neighbors, and whether that's someone right next to you or someone across the globe. Like people used to have pen pals, right? And things like that. And you would get to learn things about different people in different parts of the world. It's so easy to do that, especially with the internet now, you know? And there's all kinds of people doing all kinds of things. And, you know, aside from just the education you can gain, you can gain lifelong relationships with people that you don't know what they lead to, what they can mean, who's gonna help you out in a time of need. It could be anything, you know, who you can be creative with. And one of the beauties, again, of when I got to work at Roadrunner was that there were people I got to meet all over the world that I worked with and became friends with so many of them. And it had nothing to do, I mean, music brought us together, but it had nothing to do with work. You know, it was work brought us together to be friends. And there's people whose homes I've stayed in other parts of the world as a result, and who stayed in my home as other parts, you know, in other parts of the world as a result. And, you know, Kaves being in another borough, and like we became friends. It wasn't about work anymore, you know, and just feeding off of his creativity and him feeding off mine, and then getting to collaborate. And we didn't know that was going to happen. It came about because it was organic and it was real. So basically the things that we got to create from just getting to meet each other was amazing. And so I really encourage people to like, you know, like don't be so short with people, you know, like get to know them and understand who they are and be interested. I think it's one of the greatest things that people can do is take their interest and turn it into information, into knowledge. And that's amazing.
Loud noises.